I will make sure there are consequences. These were the words that Fernando Alonso had in response to the disappointingly predictable fake rumours that were spread around in the week of build-up before last weekend's Sao Paulo Grand Prix. A Grand Prix at which he scored his first podium in months, after a fantastic battle with Sergio Perez for P3 and a gap of only 0.053 seconds separated the pair across the line. So here's the short version of the story behind those rumours. It's the Monday after the Mexican Grand Prix and it was another week in which Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin had put together a disappointing weekend. The steps that McLaren had taken had jumped them to be the lead Mercedes customer team, and it was looking like the early season form that Fernando and Aston Martin had was not going to come back for a long time, and maybe even building into 2024 was going to be much more difficult than they'd first anticipated. The rumours that had been around all season were still swirling about Sergio Perez's future at Red Bull, the potential P2 clause that everyone says doesn't exist. So if your goal was to craft the perfect fake headline to capture F1 Twitter and cause headlines around the world, pretty much exactly what you would put together would be the idea that Fernando Alonso is unhappy with Aston Martin, and then because of that, he's going to join Max Verstappen, his new best mate at Red Bull. And that's exactly what this guy did, and then a few other more creditable journalists also started to make vague hints at a potential rumour that they had heard swirling around the paddock. But they'd only explicitly refer to it as a rumour, and obviously that move to Red Bull was never actually going to happen. But of course, what did happen is that these rumours eventually got back to Fernando Alonso, to Aston Martin and Red Bull, where they all had to speak out and say, look, we can't keep doing this every week where someone makes up a vague story that turns into a rumour. It's actually just like the Sergio Perez contract thing, really, when you look at it. Every week there's a new story that takes the general vibes around the paddock, turns it into a specific clause or something to write an article about, then we end up asking the drivers about it who speak out against it, and the media that keeps perpetuating false narratives. That's exactly what we saw with Fernando Alonso leading up to the week of the Brazilian Grand Prix, and he was annoyed. He was speaking out directly in the media, complimenting the right journalists who have earned their respect in the paddock, but also denouncing those who are seeking to only create false rumours for their own gain. So how exactly did Fernando Alonso go from being annoyed in the media earlier in the week to putting in one of his best performances of the season, maybe the drive of the season? And could a fired up Fernando Alonso be exactly what Formula 1 needs to round off the year with some excitement and head into 2024, optimistic of further battles for wins and a more competitive championship? Well, let's start by understanding how we got to this point, right? Fernando Alonso started the year with a rapid car. Even through testing, people were saying that the Aston Martin, maybe even to a greater extent than the Ferrari, looks like the next challenger to Red Bull. And after finishing on the podium in Bahrain, Fernando Alonso said, "This weekend feels like a dream, but we must stay realistic. This is just one track in the first race. Jeddah is a very different kind of circuit, a very different challenge, but I cannot wait to get back in the car." He was cautiously optimistic. Then he went on to Jeddah, that very different circuit requiring very different characteristics, and finished on pace on the podium there again. And his technical director, ex-Red Bull Aerodynamics head Daniel Fallows, echoed the same cautious optimism. Dan Fallows spoke before the start of the season to F1.com and said, when asked about his new role with the team, that we're incredibly ambitious about shortening the timescales to get to where we want to be. There's a big difference between leading the midfield teams and seriously challenging for race wins in the championship. And he was right to be confident. He said that, and then Aston Martin went on to take 6 podiums from the first 8 rounds. And those results, those points, were such a huge step for the development of Aston Martin that were recruiting like crazy. They were moving into a new building. Obviously, they'd paid all this money to bring Fernando Alonso in. They had new Saudi investors. So many things going for Aston Martin, piling on the pressure to perform, and they performed under that pressure so well at the start of the year. And as I said, they rose to the ranks to be the best customer team in the sport. Still behind some of the factory teams, still just behind Mercedes in the World Championship, but an incredible storyline, and really the main storyline that we had this year, besides Max's winning ways at the start of the season. But what was starting to become apparent about a third of the way through the season was just the level at which Aston Martin were fighting one-handed in the championship. And this weakness of Aston Martin then became a strength of McLaren, who, when their car improved, were able to fight with both drivers and deliver those valuable points, maximise those opportunities with both sides of the garage. And the fact that McLaren's intra-season development has been so much better than Aston Martin. Yes, they started from a much lower point, but they've risen so much more faster, right? That trend rate has been so much higher than Aston Martin's, to the point where now, about 2/3 of the way through the season, McLaren overtook Aston Martin and on average had a much faster car. And even despite the fact that until the Singapore Grand Prix, Fernando hadn't finished a single race outside of the top 10, there was still plenty more pressure than there was at the start of the year put on his shoulders heading into Brazil, as his recent run of form hadn't quite lived up to the expectations and the financing that Aston Martin were expecting when they started the year so strongly, right? Those bumps down in prize money as you fall from 3rd to 4th to 5th in the World Championship are really critical when they look to build investments year on year, attract new partners more than other teams, and attract talent in recruitment. So in many ways then, Fernando Alonso arrived in Brazil with two different points to prove. One to the Formula One media that had been using his name for their gain to sell their adverts and their articles on false rumours spread about his supposed disenfranchisement with Aston Martin and will to win at any cost, to keep moving teams, right? Like that's the stereotype of Fernando Alonso's career. But then he also had a point to prove to the other Formula One teams, to the teams like McLaren who had been moving up the World Championship, taking advantages of the points that used to get distributed to him and now were instead being distributed throughout the field and helping the other teams build back on the gap that they had to Aston Martin. A lot of people were thinking after qualifying when Alonso and Stroll were going to line up third and fourth in the race that maybe it was lucky, right? The rain came down just like last year, red flagged the session before anyone could get in their final soft tyre runs in, and we didn't get to see that true pace shake out over the cars. So the Aston Martin starting further forward than they had been normally in the last few rounds, people were thinking, maybe it's just a lucky fluke. It will take a lot from Alonso to really bring home the podium points in the next day. And if you watch the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, you know exactly what happened from there. A good start mixed in with good strategy, good tyre management from Fernando and really intelligent racecraft gave him just enough tyre left up at the end to have the ability to defend against a fast-charging Red Bull of Sergio Perez. But I think where the real analysis can come in for a race like this is when we talk about where that performance was really drawn from. If we think it's his anger that was coming out in the start of the week, right, he did it to prove someone wrong, to rally against people. Those sort of perceptions only really work in the short term, right? Maybe if someone's in an intense battle, if they're amplifying an already strong team with an anger, with someone to rally against, with an enemy, it can bring the best out in the short term. But it's very hard to build a castle on sand like that. It's very hard to build a team on vengeance. It's maybe even something that Mercedes have fallen victim to, right? Both Mercedes and Red Bull were so incredibly sharpened with their battle with each other, and Red Bull had been waiting in the wings for so long throughout the hybrid era to get that engine, to get those chassis and aerodynamic elements correct, to be able to compete with Mercedes. Then they finally did get to compete with Mercedes, and a lot of anger and annoyance and little bits of irritation in the press, in the FIA, and of course on track between Max and Lewis came to light that year. But it was far more than just that anger that ended up putting Red Bull's championship together, and it was far more than just that anger that's kept them winning in the following few years, right? So maybe that little burst of annoyance was enough for Alonso to get that dog in him, right? To take it personally like Michael Jordan does, and get that little bit of annoyance that all athletes in some capacity are able to use throughout their career. But if Alonso is hoping to build for 2024, right, to look optimistically into the future of the car, that anger, that annoyance, that rage is going to have absolutely no impact on the car development. What is going to have an impact on the car development and what had an impact on his race towards the end was that intelligent management, that defensive strategy, and playing all those little things, that experience in Formula One that really only Fernando and Lewis have to such a great extent. That's what's going to be able to deliver the value, and it's going to be those same things that could take Mercedes forward up to Red Bull, right? Maybe it's a fast Fernando, more than a feisty one, that Formula One needs to bring its excitement. We need that throughout the championship, right? Competition as a whole. We have battles for second, we have a very efficient press that's still able to create storylines within an era of dominance from Max Verstappen, but really those new fans, those ticket sales are going to be so much more energized by a truly competitive championship, and with a fast Fernando Alonso, you're much more likely to have that. Aston Martin have a 21-point deficit to close to McLaren in the final two rounds, but even if they don't do that, a P5 finish in the World Championship will still be a step up from where they were last year and something to build on for the future in 2024. The trend lines are not in their favour in the World Championship, but who can start faster in 2024? It could be that McLaren have put so much development to get back to the front in 2023 that they've sacrificed next year. We know that Red Bull have been so dominant that a lot of their development time has been able to be put forward to next year, so they're definitely going to start super fast. Maybe Aston Martin have done the same thing, right? There's been suspicions that some of those upgrades we saw get added to the Aston Martin and then taken off, and the speculation about them not moving in the right direction may actually have then been testing components to see what direction they need to take that 2024 car in, and some of those costs in development this year can pay off next year. So maybe they'll have a fast start in testing like they did in 2023 and be right back up at the front at the start of the year in 2024. We can be optimistic though and hope that after such a dominant year for Red Bull that we'll get some regression to the mean, some closing up of the teams like we often see in the second year of a regulation era. So let me know in the comments, what do you think? Would a Fernando Max World Championship be what you wanted to see? I think maybe when people saw that rumour of him going to Red Bull, we all started to fantasise about just how incredible that battle would be. But imagine if they were in different teams. Imagine if Aston Martin rose to the challenge of Red Bull, just like Red Bull did in their V8 days. They were a customer team, taking on the big factory outfits. Aston Martin have the best team to be a customer from. They've got the Mercedes engine. Maybe they can echo just what Red Bull were doing in their early V8 days. For now though, I'll say thank you very much for watching. Make sure to check back in with us after the Las Vegas Grand Prix. That's sure to be full of action. And check out our website too, crash.net, for coverage across the racing world.